I think the most concerning thing are the austerity policies, which usually come with most of the debt or the money that is lended to the continent. And this comes with cuts in essential services like social protection, food or energy subsidies, and these actually affect women disproportionately, and they push them behind some of the really aggravating gender inequalities that are usually faced. So I think for a start, things that really should be, the government should be actually looking out to is to make sure that there isn't a decrease in some of the social spending. So we've really seen this, for example, countries. We find that in Tunisia, for example, I mean, just going back even before the pandemic, between 2011 and 2019, the share of funding for education in the public budget decreased from 26% to about 17%. And also the share of the health expenditures reduced from 6% to about 5% in 2019. And I think this reduction in some of the public spending has a huge impact, particularly to women and girls, and it has a disproportionate impact as well. And I think we've really seen how having no investment in the public service infrastructure has devastating effects, particularly now with the issues of COVID as well. Another issue is that women tend to be concentrated, and I think you mentioned it, that there are more women than men are concentrated in lower income sectors of society, in the informal economy. And these are really one of the low echelons when you look at the public sector, and they are really affected when austerity policies are put in place. A report by Gender and Development Network, where we are partners as FEMNET, demonstrated that public debt and its servicing are a particular problem for the African continent in undermining the ability for governments to meet their commitments on gender equality and promotion of women's rights. So we see that when there's a lot of public debt, the cost of servicing this debt are very disproportionately borne by women, while the funds borrowed are rarely spent in ways and priorities for gender equality, for women's rights, and for sectors that really support women and girls on the continent. And we know that, that women rely on public services and support due to some of these disadvantages and some of the structural gender inequalities. So any cut in public spending is really going to increase, for example, unpaid care work, reducing time for women to spend in paid work, and also putting a huge burden on the amount of work that women have to do. In Egypt, for example, women are already spending an average of 30.25 hours per week on unpaid work, proving that this issue is really overlooked and sometimes is not even considered when we are speaking about macroeconomic issues. And also we see that women also take an extra burden of some of these tasks. So when governments do not provide, for example, daycare centers, this is subsidized by women. And we find that this state responsibility, even when governments borrow, they are not even supporting some of these basic needs, which will really have a huge impact in terms of the dignity and conditions for women as well. I also think that when you look at the different loans, and I think now we are all talking about the SDRs, that the priorities, when governments are given flexibility of setting priorities, the sectors which are least political sensitive. Unfortunately, these are programs which support women, and some of the marginalized groups are usually pushed back in terms of expenditure, and they are not even considered as a priority as well. So I think there should be more concentration on social services, on health, on education, on protection, and there should be that balance in terms of yes, you are building roads, yes, you are building huge infrastructure, but can you also look in terms of the social, the health, the conditions of the majority of citizens? And I like what Karina mentioned in terms of what the presidents, in terms of the opening remarks, that there's really need to include civil society and civic voices in the debt negotiations, debt reforms. But also, I think that also has a responsibility of trying to simplify, some of these conditions, because I think by making the process super complex, which of course it is, also becomes very exclusionary for civic groups, for women's rights groups to be able to contribute into these discussions, or to also present their priorities. So I do hope that going forward, there will be more engagement, which is really intentional, to be more inclusive of the different groups, particularly civil voices, women's rights groups, to be on the table in negotiating and in also prioritizing in terms of the whole, it could be debt repayment of some of these loans that we see on the continent as well. So I think we must reform the whole global financial system, and also end some of the dominance of these lenders in setting the rules to ensure that we increase more transparency. If it's in borrowing, we need to have more accountability frameworks in place. And I think we've started hearing a lot around these accountability frameworks, but they should be more inclusive in, as we are designing them, they should just not be the preserve of the lenders who come up with these frameworks. But I think we should do it in a way which is really sustainable and a way which is also inclusive. And I think one of the clear things is we should do gender analysis, impact analysis. If countries are to borrow, can they really first see what is the impact of that? And this is something which is really practical in terms of how do we make sure that issues of women and girls are included, and that when it comes up to restructuring or some of these conversations of debt, they are also freeing some of the money to finance development sectors, and particularly also sectors for social protection, education, as well as health as well. So let me stop there for now.
I think that is really interesting that you brought out the aspect of bringing in women, the need to bring in women to the negotiating table, to bring them into the discussions, in engaging them as well. From where you sit and your assessment on the global stage and on the continent as well, to what extent has there been sufficient policy space given to assessing Africa's debt crisis from a gendered perspective?
I think the space has really been narrow, and from where we sit, we haven't seen a lot of engagement of civil society generally. Yes, when of course, for example, when the IMF, when they do the consultations, they do consult some civic voices, but to the extent to which even our own governments are creating space and facilitating the voice of women, women's rights organizations to be able to support in terms of restructuring debt, or in terms of doing a gender analysis, impact assessments prior to borrowing, and even after implementation of a program. This space has really been non-existent, or where it has been existent, it has been very minimum as well. So I think this is something that we are really calling for, to say, as we are really starting to talk about engaging, having participatory processes in the whole issues around debt, I think it's important for us to be really, like I said before, really intentional in terms of how can some of the programs be structured in a way that they are doing gender impact assessments as well. And also, just as a matter of justice, to say I mean, I think we can't, we shouldn't prioritize creditors over citizens. And I think this has been said by a colleague of ours, Oria. She really says when it comes to debt issues, I think the right approach is something that we should really be using and enforcing. And for example, to say the UN binding treaty on transnational corporations, this is a legally binding framework that should really be put in place, even particularly for private lenders, for corporations, and for banks to be accountable to human rights. And I think this is something we should really be really talking about when it comes to issues around debt policies, and really evaluating them from a perspective, from a human rights perspective, and using those principles of the maximum available resources and the progressive realizations of human rights should benefit the citizens, and particularly groups which are marginalized. Yeah.
Could you just expound a little bit more on the alternative proposals that you're talking about, and what alternative proposals we should be considering?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to alternative proposals, I think one of the first proposal is to really push back in terms of, I think we should be really cautious in terms of debt which comes with conditionalities, and debt which is not going to put us into the structural adjustment programs. And this is one thing that I think we know what that means. So we should not be prioritizing sort of like when we are restructuring and having these conversations. I think we need to start prioritizing on public services, on ensuring that social protection, that we are not cutting some of the essential services. We are also considering and creating a system that is going to support the informal economy, where we know the bulk of women, the bulk of young people, that's where the bulk of them are. So this is something that we really need to start in terms of as alternatives, to start structuring it in that way, which is not going to just benefit private large corporations. I think there has been mention of issues on illicit financial flows. So how do we make sure that as we are offering alternatives, we are not perpetuating the outflow of finances from the continent, but we are actually building sustainable economy, sustainable infrastructure that will allow us to be free of these debts. So those are some of the alternatives that we should be looking at, which are really centered on improving human dignity, on improving the livelihoods of women. We shouldn't be saying we've borrowed so much, but we are still in the same cycle. We've just perpetuated the poverty that we are experiencing. So I think as we go, we need to really this is why it's important to have the voices on the ground, because the interest of our interest needs to find a voice. They need to find a landing, and they need to find a way in which the programs then are really structured to benefit us as women, as girls, but also as the majority of the African population, because these are the realities that we face all the time. Yeah.
To read and sign the Harare Declaration, go to www.afrodat.org/initiatives. Click on Afrodat Conference on Debt and Development, and then read more. And finally, the outcome statement.